So we're going to talk about the levels of organization in the human body. So we'll start from our smallest units of matter and work all the way up to the full human organism. So let's get started. The first level is the atom level. So the atom level is, as I already mentioned, the smallest units of matter. So we'll talk about this more in our chemistry section. But as we're talking about atoms, just kind of a general overview when we start here, this is what all of the parts of our bodies and everything in the world is made up of. So these are the things that we can break them down into the most purest form, and we can't get past that. So our atom, some examples are carbon. Carbon is the most important, most abundant atom in the human body. Second to that would be hydrogen. Third would be oxygen. Another example, nitrogen. And then lastly would be phosphorus. So these are actually the most abundant atoms in the human body. So most abundant, in order of most abundant to least abundant, as far as the major atoms in the body. Of course, we have things that are lesser, but these are the ones that most of our biological molecules are made out of. And then that moves us up to the next level. So our atomic level, and we'll talk about this in the chemistry section, we have our nucleus here, and we've got our electrons floating around outside of the nucleus. That's our atomic level. Then we move to our molecular level. So our molecular level are our molecules, and this is when we take two or more atoms and put them together. So two or more atoms joined together. So when we join these atoms together, we'll talk about the different types of joining, the different types of bonds that we'll see in the different types of atoms that we're working with. But some examples here would be like DNA, our information molecule in all of our cells. Another example would be glucose. Glucose is our energy molecule. We take in glucose so we can break it down and use it for energy. Or the energy molecule itself, ATP, which provides energy throughout the body. So our molecular level, or we can think of water even. Water is a molecule. So these are different important molecules for the human system. So I'll actually write the molecule or draw a molecule here. This would be the example of water as a molecule. So here, this is our oxygen. The O is the oxygen here, and then we have two hydrogens, our H2O. So we have our atomic level. Let's say we can pretend this is an oxygen here, so that we then move to our next level, the molecular level, or molecules, which is our H2O. So after our atomic level, we build up to our molecular level. Now we're going to move to the next level. The next level is the organelle level. So our organelles. And our organelles are where we have molecules then combining to form organelles. And our organelles are basically the organs of our cell. So they do specific functions. So we have molecules that are coming together to make these organelles that we find inside of our individual cells. So we're building here. We're building from something very small, an atom. We put atoms together to make molecules. We put molecules together to make organelles. So some examples of some organelles would be like the mitochondria. The mitochondria is oftentimes called the powerhouse of the cell. The powerhouse of the cell because it makes the ATP through cellular respiration. That's my crude drawing of a mitochondria, kind of cut in half there. So there's the mitochondria. Also another one is the nucleus. Nucleus houses our DNA, our molecular information. So those are some examples of organelles. And we have many organelles. We'll talk about the Golgi apparatus. We'll talk about the endoplasmic reticulum, both the rough and the smooth. So we have all of these different organelles then. When we put those organelles together, when those organelles are working together next to each other, then we get to our cellular level or our cell level. So this is where we have our organelles working together. So again, we're building here from the last level. We're combining the organelles now. And our cellular level, or our cells, are our most basic unit of life. So previously we were just working with atoms coming together to make molecules, coming together to make organelles. None of those things can actually live on their own. The smallest or most basic unit of life is the cell. So these are the basic structural and functional units of an entire organism, are the cells, our smallest living units. Some example of some types of cells that we might find in the body: epithelial cells. Epithelial cells are things like our skin cells, the cells that line our digestive tract, the cells that line our trachea, or where we breathe, going down into the lungs. So epithelial tissue, or epithelial cells, we may find some different types of nervous cells. So maybe something like the neuron, or the dendrite, or not the dendrite, that's a part of the neuron. So a neuron, or neuroglial cell. We'll stick with neuron here for the nervous system. So that's our cell. We'll do kind of a blob here, and then we have our nucleus with our information. Then we have various organelles here that I'll kind of draw in. So that's our cellular level. So we have our different organelles. This is our mitochondria, for example, and then we can see that we have our mitochondria in here, along with other organelles that make up our entire cell. So after our cellular level, then we have the tissue level. I'm sure you can guess now. Tissue, then, are actually groups of cells that are working together. So our groups of cells that are working together to perform a particular function. How about to perform a specific function? So our tissue, then we're going to combine some of these individual cells that we talked about at the previous level, and then we're going to have a tissue. So these cells aren't going to be acting on their own now. They're going to be coming together. They're going to be working together to form an entire tissue. So some examples of tissue would actually be something like an epithelial tissue. And an epithelial tissue, for example, would be like the skin, like I mentioned earlier. So in our skin, we don't have one individual cell. We have lots of cells working together to form a tissue that makes up part of our skin. Another example would be some connective tissue. We have various types of connective tissue in our body. One example of connective tissue would be like areolar connective tissue. You don't have to know that specifically at this point, but it's made up of different types of cells, and all of those different types of cells are coming together to perform a specific function. So for connective tissue, it would be like, for example, holding the skin down to the rest of the body. There's a connective function there, a basement membrane that's holding it down. Some other examples would be like muscular tissue. So also nervous tissue. So if we're talking about our neurons, for example, many neurons coming together are going to, along with some other cells, are going to make our nervous tissue. So if we think of our tissue, then we can think of, let's say, various cells coming together. These are going to be some thin flat cells, all working together to perform a particular function. There's a nucleus in there. So we have several cells there. This is kind of an example of some epithelial tissue, all coming together, or maybe some smooth muscle, to form a tissue. So then after our tissue level, so we have all of these cells coming together to form a tissue, and this tissue performs a specific function. Then we have the organ level. And the organ level are different types of tissues working together to perform a specific function. So we can just say groups of tissues. Groups of tissues working together to perform a specific function. And in this case, it has a recognizable shape as well. So some examples of an organ then would be something like the heart, right? It's a recognizable shape. Kind of generally, people know what the heart looks like. And in this case, we have different types of tissue coming together to make the heart. So we have some epithelial tissue in the way of our blood vessels that are surrounding the heart. That includes epithelial tissue. That includes some smooth muscle tissue in those vessels, some connective tissue. We also have cardiac muscle tissue in the heart. Another example would be the lungs. So we have various types of connective tissue in the lungs, also some types of epithelial tissue. Another organ, the brain. There we've got lots of nervous tissue, but then we also have some epithelial tissue surrounding it, enclosing it. So our organ, maybe I'll draw kind of a heart here. Our organ level is various tissues coming together. Very rough drawing of the heart there. We'll draw some more vessels coming out. All right, so our heart there, composed of various different types of tissues, groups of tissues working together for a specific function. So for example, the function for the heart would then be to pump the blood throughout the body. The function of the lungs would be to have a gas exchange between oxygen going into the body and carbon dioxide leaving the body. The brain would be to have connections and to be sending control and some messages. So then we have our next level, which is our organ system level. Our organ system level, then, is when we have several organs working together with a common function. So, several organs working together, again, to perform about a common function. Because in this case, if we're talking about an example, let's say the cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system, the term cardio is related to the heart, and vascular are the vessels. So our cardiovascular system, some of the organs that are working together for the cardiovascular system are the heart and then the blood vessels. Those two things aren't doing the same thing. The heart has much more of a pumping mechanism. We've got lots of excitable tissue in there. The cardiac cells themselves are sending electrical impulses to contract the heart, and we don't see that same thing in all of the blood vessels. So they're doing different things, but they're performing a common function. The common function meaning to get blood throughout the body. So the heart is actually doing the pumping, and the vessels are carrying that throughout the body. Another example of an organ system would be our skeletal system. So we have our skeletal system. We'll have different organs there, the different bones in the skeletal system. We have different connective tissue in part of the skeletal system making up our joints. We also have our muscular system. So we have the different muscles working together to perform a common function. So movement, same thing with skeletal, for structure and then for movement. So we have our organ system. Maybe I'll stick with my rough version of the heart, which in that case, when I drew the heart anyway, it had some vessels. So we'll just stick with our vessels, maybe just extend them a little bit more here. So we have our cardiovascular system. All right, so then once we get to our organ system, which we'll talk about all of the different organ systems throughout the semester, everything from our integumentary system, which is the skin, hair, and nails, all the way through to the reproductive systems. And we'll talk about that separately, all the different systems. But lastly, after we are at our organ system, the next and last level is our organismal level. So our organismal level are several organ systems working together. Oops. To form a human. All right. So we have all of these different organ systems. So we already mentioned some of them: cardiovascular system, integumentary system, respiratory system, skeletal system, muscular system. All of these systems are going to be working together to make our organism. And our organism is us, our human, the entire living individual. And so all of these different parts must come together in order to make that organism. So these are all of our organ system, or all of our levels of organization for the body here. So again, just to kind of go over this a little bit more, just to kind of summarize here, we start at our atomic level. So we have our atoms. Then our atoms are going to build. So we put atoms together. When we put those atoms together, then what we're going to end up making are molecules. So molecular or molecules. Then when we are going to put molecules together, then what we get are organelles. So some examples like mitochondria, nucleus. Then after our organelles, then we have several organelles working together. When they do that, we get to our cellular level, or cells. Actually, I'll erase that part there. There we go. Our cells. Then we have several cells that are going to be coming together. When our several cells come together, then what we get are our tissues. So some example of some tissues are our connective tissue, muscular tissue, things like that. Then as we put different tissues together, when we put different tissues together, then what we end up with is an organ. They're all going to be working together to perform a specific function. And then next, when we take our organs, different organs, and put our different organs together, we get our organ systems. And then after our organ systems, we get our organism. So you can see that we're building and building and building. We have these little tiny atoms here, little tiny carbons and hydrogens, and then we put them together to make molecules, and then we take those and we make things like organelles, and then we make our cell with different organelles in it, and then our cells come together to make a sheet of tissue with different cells in it, and then our tissues come together to make a specific organ. My lovely heart drawing. And then our organ system with our heart and our blood vessels, and then our entire organism. So we're building and building and building.